My name is Olivia Bennett. I am 32 years old, and 3 months ago, I was the kind of woman that business magazines love to describe as self made. The phrase always sounds like a compliment, but I have learned since then that it carries a warning inside it. Because the world that builds you up loves, more than almost anything else, watching you fall back down. I had built my company, EcoNest Home, from nothing. Not from family money, not from a trust fund, not from connections handed down at a dinner table I had ever been invited to. I started with a folding table in my garage, two borrowed shelving units, and a belief that ordinary household products could be made better and more honestly than the big brands were making them. Refillable soaps, organic bedding, low-waste kitchen goods. Simple things, but real things, honest things. I was proudest of that honesty. It turned out to be the thing that made me dangerous. Within 7 years, EcoNest had grown into an 8-figure brand. We had retail partnerships, supplier contracts, a small team of people I genuinely respected, and a reputation in Seattle that I had earned one product, one conversation, one difficult choice at a time. I had a beautiful apartment in Capitol Hill. I had a daughter named Emma, 7 years old, bright and gentle, with the kind of absolute trust that makes you want to become a better person just so you deserve it. And I had just enough pride to believe that if I worked harder and more honestly than everyone around me, life would eventually play fair. I was wrong about that. Deeply, completely wrong. My family name is Bennett. That name opened doors for me in Seattle's business world, and I am honest enough to admit it. My mother, Eleanor Bennett, had spent decades building the Bennett Family Foundation into one of the city's most respected charitable institutions. Her name appeared on donor walls, on hospital wings, on event programs at galas where the glasses were always crystal and the compassion was always practiced. She was a woman who had turned civility into armor, and she wore it beautifully. My older sister, Isabella Bennett Cross, ran adjacent to that world, a real estate broker with a social calendar and a smile she deployed like a scalpel. We had never been close, not exactly, but I had always told myself that families don't have to be close to be loyal. I believed that right up until the moment I discovered how wrong I was about that too. What I did not know, what I could not have imagined from inside the life I had built, was that the name I had been proud of carrying was attached to something rotten underneath. That the foundation my mother ran was not merely a vehicle for charity, that the network my sister moved through was not merely ambition, and that when I started asking questions about an invoice trail that didn't add up, I had walked straight into the center of something that had been carefully hidden for years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before all of that, I need you to understand who I was when it started. I was a woman who got up early and stayed up late. I was a mother who read to her daughter every single night, even on the nights when exhaustion made the words blur. I was a businesswoman who had looked at every supplier contract and every partnership agreement and asked myself not just whether it would make money, but whether I could look a customer in the eye and stand behind it. I was not naive. I was not reckless. I was simply the kind of person who believed that integrity was its own kind of protection. I know now that integrity only protects you from the things honesty can reach. It does nothing against the things that move in the dark. And the people closest to me had been moving in the dark for a very long time. This is the story of how I lost everything I had built, and what happened when a stranger's act of kindness, repaid a decade too late, gave me something I never expected. Not just a way back, a way forward that none of them saw coming. 6 weeks before the night that changed everything, I started noticing patterns I could not explain. EcoNest was performing well, not perfectly, but well. We had just closed a supply agreement with a regional retailer that would have put our bamboo storage line into 43 new locations. Our online sales were steady, our supplier relationships were solid, and then, in the space of 3 weeks, everything began coming apart at the seams, one stitch at a time. First, the retailer called to put our launch on hold. They were apologetic but firm. They had received anonymous documentation claiming that our bamboo storage line was sourced from uncertified overseas factories, factories with labor violations, environmental violations, the whole catalog of reputational horror. None of it was true. I had personally reviewed every certification, every supplier audit. But anonymous documents have a way of making truth feel defensive, and by the time I had assembled our records to respond, the pause had hardened into a cold delay that smelled permanent. Then our payment processor froze our online accounts. A wave of chargebacks had arrived, dozens of them all filed within a 48-hour window, and the processor needed to investigate before releasing funds. 48 hours became a week. A week became 2. The money sat locked behind a wall of process while our bills did not pause out of courtesy. Then the bank called our line of credit. Then the warehouse landlord changed the locks. I had been in business long enough to know the difference between a run of bad luck and a targeted campaign. Bad luck is random. It hits you from different directions at different times in ways that feel genuinely accidental. This was not that. This was coordinated. This was clean. This was someone who understood exactly which walls held the building up and had gone to each one with a very precise hammer. I started pulling at threads. I pulled at the vendor relationships first, and buried inside an invoice trail I had trusted for 2 years, I found something that made the hair rise on the back of my neck. One of our largest raw material suppliers had a secondary contract, a side arrangement I had never seen, never signed off on, with a shell nonprofit. That nonprofit, when I traced it far enough, connected back to my family's foundation. I sat with that discovery for 24 hours, trying to construct an innocent explanation. I could not find one. I reached out to people who should have answered. Meetings were canceled, calls went unreturned, and then my older sister Isabella called me, warmth in her voice, offering to help. She said she could speak to the right people, manage whatever rumor was spreading, smooth things over. I wanted to believe her. I had always wanted to believe the best about my family more than I wanted the truth. That wanting had been a liability I did not know I was carrying. 2 days after I accepted Isabella's offer to help, one of my longest-standing retail customers forwarded me an email. The email had been sent to them directly by my sister. In it, Isabella warned that doing business with EcoNest might expose them to reputational damage and supply chain fraud investigations. She signed it as a concerned advisor acting to protect the Bennett name. I remember exactly how it felt to read those words. It was not rage, not at first. It was something colder and more structural, the physical sensation of a floor dropping out from beneath your feet. I confronted Isabella immediately. She did not deny it. She sat across from me with the expression of someone who had already done the math and decided the numbers came out in her favor. And she told me I had become reckless, stubborn, and an embarrassment. She said I was dragging the family into a scandal I was too sentimental to survive. I drove straight to my mother's house, not to beg for money, not to launch a war. I drove there because I believed, even then, that one person in my family would look at what Isabella had done and say that it had gone too far. My mother kept me waiting in her sitting room for 20 minutes while she finished dressing for a dinner engagement. When she finally came in, she sat across from me with the expression of a woman receiving an inconvenient weather report, and she told me that when a house catches fire, you do not argue with the smoke, you step away before it stains you. Then she told me that one of her daughters was protecting the family, the other had chosen to make herself disposable. That was the moment I understood that I had not been standing outside the problem. I had been the problem they were solving. The week after my mother made her position clear, my life dismantled itself with extraordinary efficiency. My apartment lease disappeared. My business accounts were frozen. My investors went silent. First, the polite silence of people waiting for news, then the final silence of people who had already made their decision and did not feel obligated to explain it. The Bennett Family Foundation released a polished statement through its communications office confirming that the family had no connection to my business decisions and would not be commenting on the matter. I sold my dining table. I sold my camera. I sold 2 gold bracelets my grandmother had left me, pieces I had never planned to part with, and held the money in my palm and told myself it was temporary. That word, temporary, became the architecture I lived inside. Everything was temporary. The bad luck, the silence, the shrinking pile of cash. I told myself all of it had an end date I just couldn't see yet. The first weeks, Emma and I stayed in a motel near the University District. It was small and smelled like industrial cleaner and the optimism of people passing through, which is a particular kind of sad. Emma thought it was an adventure. She's the kind of child who approaches difficulty with curiosity instead of fear, which I attribute partly to her temperament and partly to the fact that she was young enough to take her cues entirely from me. I made myself sound steady. She believed me. When the motel money ran out, I folded the back seats of my SUV flat, laid out the sleeping bags I had bought at a discount outdoor store, and told Emma we were going to do something called city camping. She named the car immediately. She called it the Spaceship. She said it with complete sincerity and a kind of delight that made it almost impossible not to cry. We built a routine, because routine is what keeps the mind from dissolving under pressure. Mornings, we drove to a gas station where I had discovered the bathrooms were single occupancy and reasonably clean. Then we drove to the Seattle Public Library, which opens early and stays warm and does not ask you questions. Emma spent hours in the children's section, pulling picture books off shelves with the focused energy of a scholar, reading them twice through and then drawing her own versions in a sketchbook I had bought her with the last of a gift card. She drew houses constantly, houses with flower boxes in the windows and light coming from inside, exactly the kind of house we did not have. I spent those library hours applying for jobs. Every industry, every level, every category I had any edge in. I submitted applications until the act of submitting started feeling like dropping notes into the ocean and watching them sink. Nothing came back. At night, we parked in the far corner of a Walmart lot, where the lighting was adequate and no one asked questions. We ate peanut butter sandwiches by the dome light and played a guessing game Emma invented involving animals and countries, a game that required absolutely no materials and had rules that changed whenever she was losing. Some nights she fell asleep mid-sentence, rabbit tucked under her chin, and I sat in the driver's seat in the dark and held myself together by main force of will. I called it temporary because I could not call it home. Calling it home would have meant accepting that this was real, and some truths need to be held at a slight distance in order for you to keep functioning. What I could not hold at a distance, what broke through every wall I had built, was Emma's cough. It started as a small thing, the kind of cough children get in cold weather, a rough little clearing of the throat she tried to dismiss with a smile and a "I'm okay, Mom," that was the bravest and most heartbreaking sentence she knew. I watched her get paler. I watched the cough deepen. I touched her forehead one night and felt heat radiating off her skin like a warning I had waited too long to read. Her breathing had changed. Faster, shallower, with a wet catching quality at the end of each inhale that told a story I did not want to hear. I had $27 in my wallet. I counted it 3 times as if the number might change with additional attention. It didn't. The storm came in that night off the water, one of those hard Seattle rains that doesn't so much fall as attack, cold and relentless and indifferent to everything beneath it. And I made the only decision a mother could make. I threw the car into drive and headed for the emergency room. The emergency room was bright and crowded in the way that exhausted public places become at night, a kind of fluorescent harshness that flattens everything and makes kindness feel like an afterthought. I carried Emma through the automatic doors with her pressed against my shoulder, still wrapped in the coat I had laid over her in the back seat. She was limp and hot, and her breathing made a sound I will never fully be able to unhear. A triage nurse took one look at her and called for a room. For exactly 10 seconds, I thought we were safe. I felt something release in my chest. Not relief exactly, but the possibility of relief, which is its own kind of grace. A resident physician listened to Emma's lungs. He ordered oxygen. He said the word pneumonia. He told me they would need to admit her for treatment. Then I was directed to the admissions desk. The woman behind the glass partition was doing her job. I want to be careful to say that because it is true, and because the ease of hating her for what happened next would let too many larger things off the hook. She asked for insurance. I told her I did not have active coverage. It had lapsed when the business collapsed and taken the plan we'd been on with it. She asked for a deposit. She slid a card reader under the glass. I handed her my debit card. The machine beeped once, then again, declined. She tried a second time with the same practiced, carefully neutral expression that people develop when they need to deliver bad news all day without letting any of it attach to them. Declined again. I told her my daughter was 7 years old and was struggling to breathe. I told her a doctor had already examined her, had already said she needed to stay, had already ordered treatment. The woman lowered her voice and slid a paper estimate under the glass. I don't remember the exact figure. I remember that after the fourth digit, my brain stopped processing it as money and started processing it as a wall. They offered to discharge Emma with prescriptions. Discharge her. Into the rain, into the storm, into the front seat of a car that smelled like damp blankets and fear and peanut butter sandwiches eaten under a dome light in a parking lot. Discharge a feverish child who was having trouble breathing because the card had declined. I went back to Emma's room in a trance. A nurse with tired, kind eyes removed the oxygen sensor from Emma's finger and whispered that she was sorry. I have thought about that apology many times since then. Sorry is the most accurate and the most useless word in the world when you are poor and your child is sick. It describes the situation precisely and changes nothing about it. I carried Emma back through the automatic doors. The rain hit my face sideways, cold and hard. I laid her back in the SUV, tucked the coat around her, and gave her the last of the liquid fever medicine I had bought at a convenience store 3 days earlier with change I had scraped from the cup holders. Then I sat in the driver's seat and I broke completely open. I put my forehead on the steering wheel and I begged the universe, not out loud, not in any coherent form, just in the raw, undirected way that human beings communicate with whatever they are most desperate to believe in. I begged it not to take my daughter. I told it I had already run out of things to trade. I told it she was the only thing I had kept intact through all of it, and I needed her to stay intact. I had just made the decision to drive to my mother's house and stand on her front lawn and scream until someone opened the door, when the headlights appeared through the rain beside me. A Rolls-Royce pulled into the empty space next to my SUV, long and black and so perfectly polished that it looks like something from a different category of reality entirely, as if it had been manufactured in a world where none of the things that were happening to me were possible. The kind of car that doesn't just say money, it says a specific, old, unhurried relationship with money that has never once had to justify itself. The rear passenger door opened. A woman stepped out in a dark coat and came to my window and tapped once. Not aggressive, not uncertain, certain. I lowered the glass an inch. The rain sprayed in. She leaned down and said, "Miss Olivia Bennett?" And the world changed. Her name was Margaret Hale. She was in her 50s with silver hair pinned neatly back and the kind of eyes that have witnessed enough crisis to stop being frightened by it. She told me she represented a man named Theodore Grant. She told me he had been trying to find me for 10 years. My first clear thought was that I was hallucinating, that the fever and the rain and the weeks in the parking lot had finally crossed some threshold, and my mind was producing something to fill the gap left by hope. I told her she had the wrong person. She said, 10 years ago, on the Aurora Bridge, a sedan went through the guardrail in the rain and partially submerged. A young woman climbed down from the bridge and pulled the driver halfway through the broken window before first responders arrived. She left before anyone could take her name. Do you remember? I remembered. I remembered it the way you remember things that left marks. The cold of the water through my jeans when I dropped down to the car below. The sound of the metal still settling. The man's face through the shattered windshield. The particular color of the blood at his collar against the white of an expensive shirt. The way I kept screaming at him to stay with me and had no idea whether he could hear me. I had been 22. I had been driving home from a double shift at the restaurant where I worked 3 nights a week to keep EcoNest's first year of operations alive. The rain had been exactly like tonight's rain, attacking, relentless, indifferent. I had pulled him because he was there, because he was a person and the water was rising, and I could not drive past that and live with myself afterward. I had not known his name. I had left when the ambulances came because I had no reason to stay, and every reason to get back to the life I was barely holding together. Margaret must have seen the recognition move across my face, because her expression shifted, just slightly, the professional composure giving way to something more human. She said, "Mr. Grant is dying. He is very ill, and he only recently learned your identity through a business filing one of his attorneys flagged. He asked for you specifically." Then she looked past me, into the back seat, and she saw Emma. I watched her take in what she was seeing. My daughter, unconscious and flushed, wrapped in a coat in the back of an SUV parked outside a hospital in the rain. And the professional distance in her expression dissolved entirely. She said, "Is that your daughter?" I nodded. She said, "Mr. Grant has a private medical suite and a physician on site. If you follow me now, your daughter can be treated before we discuss anything else." Every instinct I had built over a lifetime of skepticism told me not to trust miracles that arrived in luxury cars on the worst nights of your life. Every maternal instinct I possessed, the deeper, louder, more insistent voice, told me that Emma did not have another night for my pride to work through its paperwork. I followed the Rolls-Royce. The property sat on a ridge above the city behind a gate that opened without fanfare. The house was not what I expected from a billionaire's estate. It was not flashy or excessive. It was the kind of quiet wealth that has never needed to announce itself. Stone and glass and cedar and warm interior light, surrounded by perfect silence and the smell of wet cedar and cold air. The kind of place that says the money is so old and so settled that it stopped needing to perform. Before I had fully parked, a doctor and 2 nurses were already at my back door. They lifted Emma from the back seat with practiced efficiency of people who have handled emergencies many times and have learned to move faster than fear. The physician, a white-haired man named Samuel Reeves, listened to her chest under the covered drive with his eyes closed and his face serious. He said the words severe pneumonia with a directness I found more reassuring than any amount of gentle language could have been. He said she needed oxygen and IV antibiotics immediately. They carried her inside. No one asked me for a card. No one slid a form under glass. No one recited numbers at me while my daughter struggled to breathe. They simply took her in and treated her. I stood beside Emma's bed in wet clothes and watched the oxygen monitor count upward. 90, 92, 95. When it held at 96, my legs stopped working properly, and I had to grab the bed rail because the relief hit me with the force of a physical blow. She was going to be okay. She was going to be okay, and I could feel the truth of it finally, for the first time in days. Margaret appeared at the glass and said quietly, "He would like to meet you." I looked at my daughter sleeping under clean white blankets with color slowly returning to her face, and for the first time in months, I stepped away from her bedside without feeling that the world would punish me for it. Theodore Grant's room felt like a command center that someone had softened around the edges because the person inside it was dying and had decided, finally, to allow the softer things in. There were medical monitors near the bed, their numbers quiet and steady in the dimness, but there were also shelves crowded with shipping models and bound leather ledgers, framed route maps of the West Coast ports, photographs of vessels in open water. A wall of windows faced the city lights far below, black and distant, as if the city were something he had watched over for so long he had earned the elevated perspective. He was thin. Cancer had hollowed him in the way it does, taking the flesh while leaving the essential person somehow more concentrated, more visible. He had been a large man once. You could see the architecture of it in his hands, in his shoulders, in the way he sat upright despite everything. His eyes were pale and alert, and when I came through the door, they focused on me with an expression I can only describe as settled relief, the look of someone who has been waiting a long time for the end of a story and has finally arrived there. He asked me to sit. His voice was rough but unhurried. He said, "I remember the water. I remember your hand hitting the glass and the look on your face, furious that I was making your night more complicated than it needed to be. It startled a laugh out of me, which felt strange and almost wrong, but it was accurate. I had been furious. I had been cold and frightened and furious at the inconvenience of the whole thing, which is a feeling I have since recognized as one of the mind's more ingenious defenses against terror." He told me that after the accident, he had hired people to find the young woman who had pulled me from the water. They had searched for years and found nothing. He said, "You did a significant thing and then disappeared back into ordinary life. That made you nearly impossible to track in a world full of people who are desperately trying to be noticed." A few months earlier, one of his attorneys had flagged my name in a business filing related to EcoNest. He had started reading, and the more he read about the collapse of my company, he said the less he believed it had been accidental. He asked me about EcoNest. I gave him the short version, the invoices that didn't match, the sister who offered help and then used that access as a knife, the mother who chose silence over intervention, the chargebacks that arrived too fast and too coordinated to be anything but deliberate, the whisper campaign, the frozen accounts, the investors who vanished, the accumulation of small destructions that added up to the complete erasure of everything I had built. I did not tell him directly that my family had not merely failed me. I did not need to. He already understood the shape of it. He listened without interrupting. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "There is a myth that powerful families survive because they are loyal. They actually survive because they know when to sacrifice one of their own to keep the structure clean. I know that particular breed of people very well." He told me he had built Grant Dynamics from 3 trucks and a rented loading dock in the Port of Tacoma Industrial District. It now moved freight across the entire West Coast, a major operation, privately held, built from appetite and decision-making and a willingness to outlast everyone who thought he couldn't. He said, "People imagine empires are built from vision. They are built from appetite. I had plenty of appetite. I made real mistakes along the way, but I never confused appetite with virtue, and I never let someone else's agenda become my own silence." He asked Margaret to bring a file. It was slim, nothing theatrical, nothing designed to impress, just enough to alarm. He told me his people had quietly investigated the pattern around EcoNest's collapse after recognizing my name in the filing, and the more deeply they looked, the more often one entity appeared near the edges of the story, in questionable vendor contracts, in donor pressure campaigns, in Shell consulting invoices, the Bennett Family Foundation. His voice was careful when he said it, deliberately paced, the way you speak when you know the truth will do more damage delivered slowly. He said, "I am certain enough to tell you to stop treating this as a coincidence." Theodore Grant died 4 days later, just before sunrise. The night before he passed, I sat beside his bed and read to him from one of his own shipping memoirs at his request. He said the language of logistics, tonnage and manifests and arrival windows soothed him more than prayer ever had. Emma was breathing normally by then, sitting up in the medical suite drawing little cranes and container ships for the nurses. His death should not have struck me the way it did. I had known him for less than a week. But grief does not always measure time. Sometimes it measures recognition. He was the first powerful person in months who had looked at me and seen a person rather than a cautionary tale. He saw me clearly, and then he was gone. 2 days after the funeral, Harold Whitmore, Theodore's attorney, sat across from me in a conference room above Elliott Bay and read the terms of the will without preamble or softening. The controlling 68% stake in Grant Dynamics, the estate, the private liquid portfolio, the charitable restructuring authority. I sat in the back of the car afterward with the sealed letter Theodore had left for me personally, my hands shaking so badly that I had to stop twice before I could finish reading it. He wrote that he was not leaving me a reward. He was leaving me a burden he believed I might carry honestly. He wrote that the file inside the packet contained evidence that Eleanor and Isabella Bennett had used the family foundation for years as a vehicle for fraud, personal expenditures disguised as charitable outreach, shell consulting fees, illegal fund transfers, and coordinated pressure against businesses that would not cooperate with their arrangements. He wrote that when EcoNest refused to funnel contracts through their network, and when I began asking questions, they did not merely walk away, they helped destroy me. I sat in the back seat with Emma sleeping warmly against my shoulder and the city blurring past the window, and I understood for the first time, but I had not been rescued. I had been handed a weapon, and Theodore Grant, even in death, had trusted me completely to decide what to do with it. 2.5 weeks after the will was read, Seattle's most reliably self-congratulatory charity gala took over the ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. The Bennett Family Foundation had sponsored that event for years. It was exactly the kind of room my mother loved. Crystal glasses, perfectly composed faces, the comfortable performance of generosity among people wealthy enough to write a check without checking the balance first. A room where reputation was the currency, and everyone understood the rules for keeping it circulating. I almost did not go. Then I sat with that instinct for a while and recognized it for what it was. Not caution, not wisdom, fear. The same reflex that had kept me small and manageable for years. The impulse to organize my choices around other people's comfort rather than my own truth. I had spent my whole adult life trying to earn a seat at a table that had already decided, without telling me, that I was not a permanent guest. I was done rearranging myself around that. So I went. Margaret's stylists found me a black dress that fit like certainty. Emma wore a dark navy dress with small silver flowers at the hem, and a pair of patent leather shoes she could not stop looking down at with the expression of someone who has just discovered that shoes can be a source of genuine joy. She held my hand from the car to the entrance. At the door, Margaret squeezed my other hand once and said, "Remember who had to crawl and who had to wait for the elevator." It was exactly the right thing to say. The ballroom did not go silent when I walked in. That only happens in films. What happened was subtler and, in its own way, more complete. The room kept its surface noise intact, the clink of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the gentle, competitive undercurrent of people performing their best selves for one another. But underneath it, something shifted. Attention moved. Eyes found me and stayed there a half second too long. I could feel it as clearly as temperature. My mother and sister were standing near the donor recognition wall on the far side of the room. My mother, in ivory silk, composed and perfectly placed the way she always was in public rooms. Isabella beside her in red, one hand on the stem of a champagne flute with the practiced ease of someone who has held champagne at functions since childhood. They saw me at the same moment, and for 5 full seconds, neither one of them moved. I counted to 5. I remember doing it deliberately, the way you count through something that requires steadiness. My mother's face drained first. Isabella's expression did something more complicated. It did not look like shock so much as offense, as if my return itself were an act of rudeness, as if showing up in the same room after everything they had done was a social transgression I should have known better than to commit. Then, their training activated. They crossed the room toward us wearing warmth like an accessory that does not quite match the rest of the outfit. My mother reached for Emma first, saying her name with that particular inflection she reserved for public displays of grandmotherly devotion. Emma took one small step backward until her shoulder touched my side. Children remember cold better than adults expect them to. Children are honest about temperature in ways that adults have learned to override. My mother took my elbow gently and said that there had clearly been a terrible series of misunderstandings and that we should speak privately. Misunderstandings. I repeated the word back to her the way you repeat something that doesn't deserve to go unchallenged. She kept her composure. Isabella leaned in close, lowering her voice to the register of a woman who understands that controlling a conversation is as much about managing the acoustics as the content. She told me that everyone in Seattle now knew about Theodore Grant, that it had all happened very suddenly, and that she and her mother simply wanted to ensure I was protected from people who might try to take advantage of me. I almost admired the speed of the repositioning. She had gone from executioner to concerned advisor in fewer than 48 hours. The mechanisms of their social survival were genuinely impressive in the way that certain dangerous things are impressive when you can see them clearly enough from far enough away. My mother added that family matters should be handled quietly and with dignity, that Emma did not need to be exposed to instability, and that if I needed help navigating my new responsibilities, we could work toward rebuilding trust and reaching sensible arrangements. Sensible arrangements. That phrase. What she meant was, sign something, share something, hand over enough control that we can feel secure about what you know. What she was offering was not reconciliation. It was access to containment. My mother reached toward Emma then, perhaps calculating that the fastest route back into my life was through the softest opening she could find. Emma pulled her hand away before I had to say a word. I will carry that moment for the rest of my life. Isabella recovered and smiled harder and said through her teeth that they were offering grace. I said no. You are offering access. There is a difference. My mother's voice cooled by precisely half a degree. She said new money disappears faster than old problems. And then, because the months in the parking lot, the hospital, the rain on the windshield, the oxygen monitor counting up, all of it rose in me at once, and I was done being managed. I said the one thing I knew would cut through every pretense in that room. I said, interesting. Neither of you remembered we were family when my daughter had pneumonia in the back of a car. The silence that followed was physical. My mother's face went rigid. Isabella glanced around at who had heard. The answer was nearly everyone. They moved faster after the gala because humiliation is gasoline for people who have always run on the belief that their version of events is the one that gets to be true. Within 48 hours, a carefully placed article appeared online, the kind of piece that never quite makes a direct accusation, but arranges its sentences in a way that leads the reader precisely where the source intended. It implied I had manipulated a dying man during his final weeks, positioning myself to inherit from someone who was too ill to make clear decisions. Isabella reposted it with a caption about the importance of due diligence and the dangers of emotional fraud. A week later, my mother's attorneys filed a petition requesting grandparent visitation rights with Emma, citing concerns about my sudden financial instability, my recent period of homelessness, and what they described as my exposure to undue influence following a traumatic financial collapse. They were not trying to win. They were trying to remind me that even now, even with everything Theodore had left me, they still believed they could reach into my life and shake it until I dropped something valuable. They were trying to communicate with the precision of people who have always used legal instruments as social messages that I was still within reach. What they did not know was that I had stopped responding to them as the woman they had raised. I had started responding as the woman who had survived them, and those are two entirely different people. While they were feeding rumors to journalists and filing court petitions, Harold Whitmore had already engaged Victor Lane, a forensic accountant whose relationship with financial records is best described as surgical. Victor moved through the foundation's ledgers and the shell company structures with the quiet intensity of someone who finds moral offense in bad arithmetic. He found money from the foundation routed through consulting firms that existed almost entirely on paper, formed, billed, and dissolved with minimal activity between the invoices. He found those funds looped back through a real estate holding company tied to Isabella's husband's brokerage practice. He found invoices for sustainability outreach programs that corresponded in timing and amount almost exactly to the pressure campaign that had frozen EcoNest's vendor relationships and scared off our retail partners. The cruelest detail was how small some of it was. They had not dismantled my company to protect a vast empire of irreplaceable magnitude. They had done it to keep a collection of profitable small lies intact. They had used me as a cost of doing business. My mother requested a private meeting. She wanted to speak at the family's downtown office, the same building where I had waited after school as a child, sitting on a leather bench in the lobby while she finished board meetings. I agreed to the meeting. I told Harold I would go only if the adjoining conference suite could be lawfully monitored and recorded. He arranged it. Isabella arrived first. Cream wool, sharp angles, the energy of someone who has already decided the outcome and is working backward from it. She was pacing when I came in. My mother arrived second. Navy silk, pearl earrings, composure so finely maintained it had become a form of pressure. There were no performances of warmth this time. The room had the atmosphere of a transaction, which at least had the merit of honesty. My mother opened with the usual architecture. The press was getting ugly. Emma deserved stability. The family could establish a private trust if I would simply agree to avoid unnecessary public conflict. I asked what avoiding conflict meant in practical terms. Isabella answered before my mother could. She told me to stop pretending I had earned anything. She told me to sign over a controlling interest in Grant Dynamics to an outside management vehicle that they would approve, to shut down whatever investigation my lawyers were pursuing, and to release a public statement attributing the previous conflicts to stress and misunderstanding. She said misunderstanding the way pest control says infestation. I asked whether it had also been a misunderstanding when chargebacks arrived in my accounts within 48 hours, whether it had been a misunderstanding when suppliers' side contracts led back to the foundation. My sister went very still, and then she laughed. It was not a comfortable sound. She said, "EcoNest was never going to survive. You were too sentimental to build something that could scale. All we did was accelerate the inevitable." My mother cut in sharply, telling her not to be careless, but the carelessness was already on the record. Then Isabella reached for the final card she believed she held. She said that if I forced a public confrontation, every ugly day Emma had spent in that vehicle would surface in court. She said judges cared about demonstrated stability, not feelings, and that I might want to think carefully about whether I wanted my daughter interviewed by child welfare investigators. She said it the way someone says checkmate when they have forgotten they are playing against someone who knows where all the pieces actually are. I looked at her and said, "You really think I am still the woman who came here asking for mercy?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. My mother delivered her final line with the conviction of a woman who had made every difficult choice by calling it philosophy. She said, "Families survive by closing ranks." I told her some families survive by eating their own. When I walked out, Harold was in the adjoining room with Victor Lane and an assistant district attorney from the King County Financial Crimes Unit. Every word had been captured, every threat, every admission. The petition for visitation was withdrawn 3 days later. The first subpoena arrived the week after that. The legal process moved with a speed that surprised even Harold, which he said privately was a measure of how complete and well-organized the evidence turned out to be. Victor Lane's forensic audit was, in Harold's words, devastating. Not merely thorough, devastating. The kind of documentation that doesn't leave structural alternative interpretations. Former Foundation employees, confronted with records they had assumed were safely obscured, cooperated with investigators in a sequence that Harold described with the neutrality of a man who has seen it many times. The first one hesitates, the second one watches the first one agree to cooperate, and after that, the line moves quickly. Isabella's husband, facing charges that overlapped with his brokerage license and his liberty simultaneously, cooperated before the ink on the first subpoena was fully dry. Isabella took that personally. I imagined she took it as the final indignity in a series of events that were not supposed to have consequences. My mother, who had spent her life operating in rooms where the rules bent toward people like her, retained the most expensive defense attorneys in the Pacific Northwest and appeared to believe, right up to the morning of the pre-trial hearing, that the weight of her name and the quality of her legal representation would reshape what had happened into something more manageable. I was in the courtroom for the hearing.
I did not bring Emma inside. Margaret waited with her in a private conference lounge with coloring books and a plate of fruit, and the kind of patient, steady presence that Emma had come to trust over the preceding weeks. But I wanted my mother and sister to know that I was there. I wanted them to understand that I no longer had to choose between protecting my daughter and telling the truth. I could do both at the same time. They both turned when I entered. Neither had expected me. When I testified, I did not perform. I did not arrange my face into grief or force tears I did not feel in that moment. I explained the business timeline with the precision of someone who had lived inside every detail of it. I described the invoice structures, the donor pressure patterns, the timing of the chargebacks, the vendor relationships that evaporated in coordinated sequence. I described the statements made in the monitored office, the admissions about EcoNest, the threats about Emma, the offer of access disguised as reconciliation. Then I described the night Emma got sick in the back of the SUV. I want to be precise about why I included that testimony. Not for pity, not to perform suffering for a courtroom. I included it because harm deserves to be measured where it actually lands, not in abstract figures and legal definitions, but in the concrete, specific weight of it. A 7-year-old child with severe pneumonia turned away from emergency treatment, lying in the back of a car in a storm. That was the landing place of what they had done. That was the real address of their choices. My mother watched me testify with an expression I have spent considerable time trying to name and have never fully succeeded. It was not remorse. Remorse would have required her to locate somewhere within herself a belief that I had been worth more than I cost. What her expression contained was something closer to shock, the genuine shock of a woman discovering that her daughter had stopped arranging herself around her comfort, that I had become someone she did not have the tools to manage. Isabella's composure held until the prosecution played the recording from the monitored office. Hearing your own voice explain away another person's destruction has a way of stripping the performance out of a person. She went pale in a manner that the expensive cream wool did nothing to offset. The convictions came 6 weeks later. Guilty on the major counts: wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, obstruction, conspiracy. Restitution ordered in the millions, assets frozen pending further proceedings. The Bennett Family Foundation dissolved under court supervision, its remaining legitimate assets redistributed to actual charitable organizations by court order. Isabella lost her real estate license before sentencing was complete. The state licensing board moved with a speed that suggested they had been waiting for exactly this kind of confirmation. The judge was a woman old enough to be unimpressed by reputation and composed enough to say what she thought clearly. She said from the bench that charity used as camouflage for greed is still greed, and that blood used as leverage is still abuse. She sentenced them each to 7 years in federal prison. My mother was taken from the foundation's townhouse just after dawn on a gray Monday that smelled of wet pavement and the coffee carts already setting up near the courthouse. Isabella was arrested outside her brokerage office while junior agents were setting out bottled water for a property presentation in the conference room upstairs. The number that made the headlines was $14.2 million because greed is easier for the public to process when it comes with specific digits. The detail that mattered more to me was buried lower in the articles, in the section most readers don't reach. Part of the documented money trail connected directly to the destruction of EcoNest, fraudulent consulting fees, and coordinated pressure on vendors and lenders used as instruments of personal retaliation against a woman who had started asking the wrong questions. They had not merely stolen from strangers, they had used the proceeds of theft to sharpen the knife they put in my back. On the courthouse steps, reporters called out questions. Did I feel vindicated? Did I feel guilty? Did I think 7 years was appropriate for family? I said, I did not send my mother and sister to prison. Their choices did. I was simply the first person in that family who stopped cleaning up the language around what they had done. Then I stepped away from the microphones. Emma was waiting under a black umbrella with Margaret, wearing the expression she gets when she senses that adults are performing simplicity around something that isn't simple. She asked if it was over. I knelt down to her level and told her the truth in plain language. The lying part is over. The rebuilding part starts now. She thought about that for a moment, the way she thinks about things that matter to her. Then she took my hand and said, "Good, I like the rebuilding part better." So do I.
In the months that followed, I did not become the kind of person that magazines like to photograph beside glass staircases with the word resilience printed underneath. I became something less photogenic and more useful. I became busy. Grant dynamics needed real attention, not the attention of someone performing stewardship for the optics, but the kind of patient, structural work that turns a good company into a reliable one. I commissioned supplier transparency audits across the full West Coast operation. I built an ethics policy with actual enforcement mechanisms, not a document filed somewhere impressive and never consulted, but a living policy with a compliance team that reported directly to me and had genuine authority to act. I brought in labor practice consultants for the warehouse operations and implemented wage review processes that had not existed under the previous structure. Theodore had built something real. I intended to make it honest. I also funded a pediatric emergency access program at the hospital that had turned Emma away. I want to say that plainly, without sentimentality. The same hospital, the same emergency department. I sat in a conference room with the hospital's chief medical officer and their foundation director, and I told them directly what had happened that night. I told them about the card reader beeping twice. I told them about the paper estimate slid under the glass while my daughter's oxygen levels were dropping. I told them about the oxygen sensor being removed from Emma's finger. The program we established creates a dedicated emergency fund for pediatric cases where families cannot pay the deposit. No child in that facility will be discharged in the middle of a medical crisis because a card declines. I made them put that in writing. I made it specific and I made it enforceable. Because vague good intentions are the currency of people who want credit without accountability, and I was done with that entire economy. I also quietly rebuilt EcoNest, not as a vanity brand, not as a monument to what had been destroyed, but as a sourcing and consumer goods line inside Grant's logistics division, honest supply chains, certified materials, open contracts. Everything I had wanted the original company to be, now with the infrastructure to do it properly. We called it EcoNest Verified, and the first product line sold out within 2 weeks of launch, which I did not allow myself to treat as vindication. I treated it as a starting point. Emma got her purple bedroom. I want to pause on that because it matters more than most of the things I have just described. She used to draw houses in the Seattle Public Library while I applied for jobs on the computer terminals across the room. Houses with flower boxes in the windows and light coming from inside, drawn on library paper and sometimes taped to the ceiling above the sleeping bags in the SUV. She drew them the way children draw the things they want most, with total commitment and no irony. She got her purple bedroom with built-in shelves for her books and a window that looked out over the garden and light that came in warm in the mornings. She still draws houses sometimes. Now they are architectural in a different way, more complex, more specific, as if she is designing rather than wishing. Some nights she asks me if I remember the spaceship. I tell her I do. I always will. Forgetting would be another kind of betrayal, a betrayal of the version of us who lived in it, who held on inside it, who found a way to still be okay inside it. The spaceship was ours, and I will not erase it by pretending the whole story started with the Rolls-Royce. What I know now, having lived through the complete arc of it, is several things that took me longer than they should have to learn. Money does not save people. Money changes the scenery. It removes certain categories of immediate danger. It buys room to breathe and time to think and access to systems that were always theoretically available to everyone, but practically available only to some. Money is useful, and I will not perform ambivalence about having it. But the thing that changed the structure of my life was not the inheritance. It was the truth, documented and delivered and no longer deniable.
truth changes structure. Money only changes scenery. I also know that family is not defined by the last name you carry. It is not defined by shared blood or shared history or the expectation of loyalty that gets handed down alongside the furniture. Family is defined by who still shows up when loving you becomes genuinely inconvenient. Theodore Grant, who I knew for less than a week, showed up. Margaret Hale, who had no obligation to anything beyond her employer's instructions, showed up again and again. Emma has shown up every single day of her life with a completeness that I do not deserve and will spend the rest of my life trying to earn. The strangest thing people say about stories like mine is that they end with fire, with rage and confrontation and the dramatic heat of justice delivered. But the most real part, the part I return to most often, is the quiet that came after. The school pickup, the grocery run, the evening on the couch with Emma doing homework beside me while I review shipping manifests. The ordinary life that does not require the temperature of anyone's cruelty to organize itself around. My mother and sister taught me, through their choices, what it looks like when people confuse power with permission and appetite with right. That lesson cost more than any education should, but I have spent it carefully. Emma asked me once, on a quiet evening not long after everything was settled, what I had learned from it all. She was 8 by then and had developed the habit of asking the question she actually wanted answered instead of the one she thought she was supposed to ask. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I said, I learned that silence can feel noble when you're trying to keep the peace, but when silence is protecting cruelty, it stops being kindness. It becomes permission. And I learned that a little too late to save the life I had, but not too late to build a better one. She nodded like someone taking a note. Then she said, I am not going to be silent. I looked at her, this child who had ridden through the worst of it with a rabbit under her chin and a name for our broken-down car, and I told her, no, you are not. And that is the best promise either of us could ever make. Today, Emma has a safe bed, a warm coat, and a mother who no longer mistakes endurance for strength. That is the inheritance I intend to pass on. Everything else is just logistics.